Welcome to the Dr. Harold C. Deutsch World War II History Roundtable. This is our 27th year, the beginning. A year and a half ago, we did a tour to England. We did the Battle of Britain, and you can see all the movies and read all the books, but you got to be there. We try to have the books, have the historians as a part of our programs, but we also like to take people to the places where they happened. Sometimes I think we become overwhelmed with the American involvement, and going around Britain, seeing the war that they suffered for 2 years before we got into it, is a story that sometimes we don't know. That's what we're trying to accomplish this evening. We've got two speakers, as I mentioned, Dr. Robin Higham, who was in the RAF from 43 to 47. He can tell some other stories about his experience here. His father actually met Harold Deutsch at the school at the University of Virginia when they were prepping to go into the service. He has written 35 books, edited 35 other books, and a great resource. Dr. Higham, welcome to Minnesota. I yield to you, sir.
The RAF, in my biased view, was one who wrote, my biased view as one who wore the pilot's brevet, was the world's first independent air force. By the 1940 Battle of Britain, it could claim to be the best air force in the world, and it added to the luster of its reputation by not losing the heroic contest. However, as the Duke of Wellington said of Waterloo in 1815, it was a near-run thing. As I've noted in Two Roads to War and on the French and British air arms from Versailles to Dunkirk, and in the sequel, Unflinching Zeal, the air battles over France and Britain between May and October 1940. The Royal Air Force, as it entered the Second Air Defense of Great Britain, it had been involved in the first one in 1918, was both well and ill-equipped for the task. On the one hand, it had been made independent by Act of Parliament of 1917, and further in 1923 was charged by the Cabinet with the role of Home Defense Air Force, composed 2/3 of bombers and 1/3 of fighters. On the other hand, in late World War I, its predecessor, the Royal Flying Corps, had developed in 1917 and 1918 the London Air Defence Area, or LADA as it was known, as a protection against German daylight bombers. In 1919, one of the RAF supporters claimed that its puny independent force bombing Germany from France at the end of the Great War was not an independent air force. It was only free of grand strategic supervision by the Allied headquarters in Paris. One of the controversial myths of the 1918 period was the confusion between the independent air bombing force under London's control in France and the newly independent Royal Air Force. The former was to be the Anglo-French agreement under the Allied grand strategy. Headquarters involved in its plans, but was designed to strike the German hinterland and controlled by London. The real independent air force in 1923 became the basis of the RAF's Home Defense Air Force. And by the way, I'm talking only about the RAF in England and leaving out the colonial operations, etc. In the 1920s, the RAF was, however, essentially a colonial force restricted by the 1919 view that there would need to be no preparation for a major war for 10 years, by the drive for public economy of Sarah Geddes's Geddes Acts, and by the ongoing feud between the Air Force's leader, Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Trenchard, and the Royal Navy's Admiral of the Fleet, Earl Beatty. In the years 1923 to 1944, the Home Defense Air Force, which became from 1936 Bomber Command, was largely impotent. On the positive side, the Royal Air Force College at Cranwell opened in February 1920 to produce officers to replace those Trenchard had hand-picked for the post-war Air Force, and the Technical Training School based at Halton since 1915 to replace ground crew. Thus, when the crises of the late 1930s came, the RAF was able quickly to man and maintain the masses of planes and other materials spewing eventually from the Ring, the nucleus of supply firms, and its affiliated shadow factories. Associated with the motor industry to produce aircraft and spares, as well as create crews from the Empire Air Training Schools. But in the 1920s, progress was slow for lack of money, though stimulated by the Air Ministry cost plus 10% development contracts for both airframes and engines. From 1924, the Principal Supply Officers Committee explored expansion scenarios based upon World War I experience. The published History of the Ministry of Munitions, which appeared in 1922, and estimates as to what it would take to return the RAF to its strength in 1918. That proved to be impossible. Its actual strength was just about 300,000. Meanwhile, much of the interwar years was spent by British pilots either practicing for the annual Hendon Air Show or on leave. And at the same time period, the active RAF was engaged in colonial politics, policing in Iraq, Egypt, and India. The Short Service Commission was introduced in 1925 to provide a non-career path of 5 years for those desirous of learning to fly and to provide the RAF with a reserve. At the end of their service, those officers could apply to join the regulars, which a few of them were able to do. In addition, the weekend warriors, the Auxiliary Air Force, also came into being as another form of reserve. Apart from the lack of money and the pacifism of the day, there was a steady impact of the technological revolution in airframes, engines, and fuels, as well as metallurgy. For example, the metal tubing fuselage with canvas covering, as conceived in 1924 and then used in the 1931 Fury II biplane, single-seater, which was considered the finest aircraft in the world and the most beautiful at that moment, finally gravitated into the 8-gun Hurricane of 1936. And the long familiarity with RAF maintenance made battle damage in Hurricanes repairable within the unit versus Supermarine Spitfires, which looked so beautiful, had to be sent back to the factory for repair. The advances in fuels and to a reliable 87 octane enabled the Royal Rolls-Royce Merlin engine to deliver 1,000 horsepower versus the American Liberty engine of 1918's 400 horsepower on the same 1,625 cubic inch displacement. That gives you an idea of progress. It also provided the power for hydraulic undercarriage retraction, for radios, and for 8 rather than 2 guns. The new 1,000 horsepower engines also enabled new fighters to carry on radio conversations, thus allowing ground controllers to direct airborne defenders. At the same time, new designs had to be able to tolerate the extra weight of parachutes, only, by the way, installed in RAF aircraft in 1928, and of oxygen equipment, which was still not perfected in 1940. The new 1936 fighters succeeded the dream machine, the 640 horsepower twin-gunned Hawker Fury 2 biplane, which it's still open cockpit and maximum 230 mile an hour and admiral speed and admiral aerobatics. The Air Ministry's 1936 paper, not well known but very important, was called the Air Staff Memorandum number 50, SD 98 for secret document, Consumption and Wastage in War. That document is extremely interesting because it gave commanders tables to figure out exactly what they would need in ammunition, fuel, and other resources, and it was modified during the war to show the amount that new aircraft would use. For instance, the 2,000 horsepower Griffin Spitfires needed twice the fuel that the 1941s did. SD-98 expected a squadron of 12 aircraft to be airborne 5 times daily with 8 guns fully armed with 500 rounds per gun to expend 100% at 15 seconds, or a total of 12,900,000 rounds per week, and would require 340 million rounds available monthly in 1941. But in 1939, the cabinet discovered there were only 9 million rounds in stocks. So the effectiveness of the new Hurricanes and Spitfires, which first flew in 1936, depended upon gunnery. As part of that improved gunnery requirement, on and off since 1918, a question of caliber had been argued, tested, and discussed. All through the Air Staff Committee meetings, which consisted of the Air Fighting Committee, the Gun Subcommittee, Tactical Committee, the basic question was whether to accept the hitting power of the Vickers half-inch machine gun or the mass fire of 1,200 rounds per minute of, by then, the new Browning 303. The problem was that tests against static targets indicated that 303s did little damage, especially at ranges over 400 to 600 yards. On the other hand, the more ponderous Vickers was effective at 600 yards or better. One persistent member of the Air Fighting Committee was a bomber pilot named Group Captain Robert Dickinson Oxland, who became Director of Research Services at the Air Ministry in December 1938. He championed the need for a high rate of fire because RAF pilots were such poor shots. Furthermore, 2 questions for the testing and discussions of the period to 1934 were what if the economy provided what if the enemy provided armored protection and heavier guns. Interestingly, during this period, the RAF actually was buying foreign guns and had an arsenal of them in order to find out what they could do. The RAF response, however, to the idea of cannon and armor was they hoped the enemy wouldn't do it. There's a lot of unreality in this period. The optimism was basically destroyed over Heligoland Bight on the 18th of December 1939, when 12 out of 18 twin-engine Wellington bombers were lost to cannon-armed Me-109s and Me-110s in spite of their 4 303 gun tail turrets. That saved the Home Defense Air Force from trying to penetrate German airspace in daylight. However, the Air Ministry's first approach was these people are bad formation flyers. At the same time, the RAF did not believe in air escorts because Stanley Baldwin, the Prime Minister, had told Parliament in 1932 the bomber would always get through. In 1931, the Japanese invaded Manchuria. At that time, the 52 Squadron Home Defense Air Force was still not completed. in part because disarmament was still the international edict and the Cabinet's 10 years rule of 1919 was still in force, which stated that budgeting should assume that there would not be another war for 10 years. However, the interim Defense Requirements Committee, formed early into the 30s, persuaded the Committee of Imperial Defense and the Cabinet that restraints should be abandoned and planning to return Britain to a great power status should go ahead. The result was that as soon as the Geneva Disarmament Conference failed in 1934, and at the same time it became apparent that Hitler would rearm Germany, the British government decided to rearm. The RAF budget went from £16 million in 1932 to 86 million in 1936, and 106 million plus supplemental appropriations in 1939-40. Expansion, with a capital E, became the order of the day. New types of aircraft were put in hand, new permanent airfields and training facilities built, and the RAF prepared for war. In fact, the Air Council became the Expansion Committee. Significant also amongst these developments was the discovery of radar in 1934 and its rapid adoption and expansion on the basis of the 1918 London Air Defence Area, as well as progress of the technological revolution, which had started in 1929. From this emerged the modern RAF, the demands of manpower including the RAF VR, a new formation in 1936, and the Women's Auxiliary Air Force shortly afterwards, a revival of the Women's Royal Air Force of 1918. And all of this demanded a trained, skilled force, especially in electronics, in a country still acquiring home radios with skilled industry to support them. And all through the war, that was one of the big problems the RAF had, was finding skilled radar mechanics, because there simply weren't any in the civilian organization. Additional technological improvements for the RAF had come in 1927, when it finally introduced parachutes, and in 1928 the safety harness. Though invented in 1918, it was designed to stop aircrew from falling out of the aircraft when they did aerobatics. And the Mae West inflation device to keep pilots afloat also appeared in 1932. But incredibly, for an island nation, there was no air-sea rescue service until the Battle of Britain itself. Pipelines for petrol were being laid and storage expanded to meet the forecast demands for fuel, spares, ammunition, and stores. As part of expansion, the 1924-1936 Air Defence of Great Britain Command was in mid-1936 split into fighter, bomber, coastal, and training commands, followed in 1938 by maintenance and army cooperation. These functional organizations lacked, however, the equivalent of the Royal Navy's first Sea Lord, which was an executive appointment. It wasn't until 1944 that the Chief of the Air Staff gained the authority to actually direct operations. In the later 1930s, the Air Ministry was headed by World War I pilots, but manned by officers lacking war experience, and had to establish chains of readiness, repair, and supply, but hampered by peacetime policies, such as that spares were not ordered until a new type had been in service for 18 months. And so they could tell what the wastage rate was. And that manufacturers were paid only for completed aircraft. So when there was a demand for spares, which in fact should have been about 20%, production line had to be stopped while spares were manufactured. When Hitler, Chamberlain, Mussolini, and Daladier met at Munich in September 1938, the subsequent RAF inquiry revealed a great state of unreadiness and the consequences of peacetime policies. British efforts were thus galvanized because, in spite of Prime Minister Chamberlain's assurance of peace when he came back from Munich, the country's acceptance, testing, and subsequent modification began by summer 1939 to allow the issuance of Spitfires and Hurricanes and a few Bulletin-Paul turret two-seat fighters to squadrons. By the Battle of Britain in the summer of 1940, there would be 19 Spitfire, 29 Hurricane, and 1 Defiant formation under Air Chief Marshal Hugh Dowding in fighter command, and in the Vital Number 11 group under the veteran Air Vice Marshal Keith Park in southeast Great Britain. As to airfields, those essentials of strategy, the 52 of 1934 were in the process of expansion, eventually to over 600 in 1945. From a 500-yard grass circle to the standard three-directional runway layout, in part to replace World War I airfields and in part to modernize the RAF airfields left over from 1918, and requisition, these fields were supplemented with properly designed and purpose-built accommodations for personnel and machines. An operation augmented from 1934 in the expansion scheme labeled A through M. With underpowered biplanes, these fields were 500 yards in diameter with a visible bombing circle in the middle. However, weights of aircraft and more powerful engines led to the development of standard wartime three-runway layout with paved perimeter tracks and hard stands. Internal distances were based, however, upon marching to and from work, which resulted in what turned out to be an unacceptable cluster of buildings. In addition, with the accompanying increase in repair and salvage units, to which new machines were delivered to be made ready for combat, and the civilian repair organization, which came into being with civilian test pilots being employed so as to avoid the disruption of Air Ministry postings. As an example, British air racer and test pilot Alex Henshaw tested a combined 33,000 new and repaired Spitfires from the factory at Castle Bromwich alone, although actually only a total of 20,331 were built by all constructors. But expansion had to encompass both material and manpower. So while factories were busy turning out aircraft, engines, and auxiliary equipment, contractors readying airfields, the Air Ministry revived not only intense training of aircrew in Britain itself, but the newer British Commonwealth Air Training Plan, originally called the Empire Training Plan, in Canada, the USA, South Africa, and Australia, as well as in the Middle East. The advantage was planned training that could be carried out in better weather and with no enemy interference. At the same time, other pilots had received their brevets. Instead of going to a squadron to be brought up to operational standard on the aircraft they would be flying in combat, they were, from September 1939, sent to 3 new operational training units, or OTUs. This relieved the squadrons of the chore and improved accident rates. However, in early 1940, the Inspector General of the RAF found that the serviceability rate for the machines at the OTUs was 59% versus 75% in fighter and bomber squadrons. His inquiries revealed that the mentality of station administrators had not shifted from peacetime to war, and that I was still encountering that in 1944. Instructors were required to be officer of the day, and scarce fitters and riggers had to do sentry duty. Still, however, there was an acute shortage of spares of all kinds, and once war was declared on 3rd of September 1939, other serviceability difficulties arose. Meanwhile, what in January 1940 became British Air Force's France was to start with two separate bodies controlled from England. The air component of the British Expeditionary Force, carved out of the despised Army Cooperation Command, and the Advanced Air Striking Force, or Bomber Command. Relations with the ill-prepared French were not very amicable, from French rations to billets to unprepared airfields. On top of these, the winter was the harshest in European history, and because the defense contre-avion, the French anti-aircraft, was very trigger-happy, you have the interesting situation that the Fairey Battle light bombers did their night flying over Germany, and the Whitley heavy bombers dropped leaflets there too. At the same time, the Battle of France opened on 10th of May 1940. The Armée de l'Air, the French Air Force, only just had heard of radar, and two of its three fighter types were obsolescent, not to mention its tactics, which did not allow them to catch the faster German bombers, as I've stated in Two Roads to War. French Air Force was a gallant but impotent force designed to protect infantry. The British Air Force's France was in action from French soil only from 10th of May to the end of the month. Thereafter, it was withdrawn to Britain, re-equipped, remanned, and rested for June and July. But the war ended on the 24th of September, 24th of June, excuse me. Yet, as described in Unflinching Zeal, the 46-day Battle of France and the 43-day Battle of Britain were really linked campaigns. In a way, both were 1918-style struggles, with the trenches in France replaced by the English Channel, and artillery replaced by fighter command, and massed infantry abandoned to fighter pilots. Both significant differences in national character and morale were evident in the air as catalogued in Unflinching Zeal. Neither the French Air Force nor the RAF had considered the need to develop tactics against escorted bombers, and as noted, the French had not heard of radar until shortly before active hostilities began on the 10th of May. It is literally true, they had only heard of it. They had, I think, about 5 French officers had actually been shown a set. Neither air arm was aware of the importance of parrying a blow rather than winning a victory, as noted in Two Roads to 1940. Significantly, unlike the Commander-in-Chief of the Armée de l'Air, Joseph Villemin, Air Officer Commanding-in-Chief of Fighter Command, Dowding, was not obliged to consult the chiefs of the Imperial General Staff. In contrast, he and Sir Frederick Pyle of Anti-Aircraft Command worked in daily harmony. Moreover, they benefited from economic actions maintained by the General Post Office, for instance, as in 1918, rapid reports from the Observer Corps could reach sector stations in seconds rather than in France's in hours. The situation changed drastically by July. The Luftwaffe and the RAF faced each other across the Channel. Though safe from panzers behind their moat, Dowding as AOC and C had 3 disadvantages. First, his command in Great Britain did not include bomber command, so he was unable to order coordinated airstrikes on the new 50 Luftwaffe airfields within range with their roughly 50 aircraft on each. In 1941-42, Dowding's successor, Sholto Douglas, did have the light bombers under command and was able to launch costly rhubarbs offensives over France, in which he lost more aircraft than Dowding lost in the Battle of Britain. Dowding's second handicap was the proximity of his headquarters at RAF Bentley Priory to the Air Ministry in London. This meant time had to be taken by calls to attend meetings and conferences at the Air Ministry. From the air staff, as when the big wing controversy developed, that suggestion to confront the Luftwaffe bombing raids with formation of at least 3 to 5 squadrons, proposed by Air Marshal Lee Mallory of No. 12 Group, and spokesperson being Sir Douglas Bader during the Battle of Britain. And Dowding's third problem was the question of when he should retire from the RAF, a decision put off pre-war by his probable successor being in an accident. Not until after the Battle of Britain was he summarily notified that he would head a mission to the United States to explain the battle. It was not a great success. Dowding was known as Stuffy. He was a scientific officer, but not a self-seeker. In 1934-36, however, the RAF was essentially still a 1919-1924 organization. It was active in the colonies and India, using two-seater general-purpose biplanes as policemen. It had a few twin-engine transport bomber aircraft, and at home a few single-seat fighters and two-seat fighter bombers, which latter could strike Paris. In 1936, the Air Council had become the Air Ministry Expansion Committee, just as the Air Defense of Great Britain was split into its component parts. Far from muddling through, the Air Ministry and the RAF had futuristic plans that encompassed what was needed to put the Air Force on a war footing. The very British view that, in sharp contrast to the approach to Paris, the commanding General Wülleman was still reorganizing in May 1940, while the contracting structure was such that the French Air Ministry and the Air Force General Staff in Paris had no idea of how many of any type of aircraft were actually bon de guerre, serviceable, again, as noted in Two Roads. From 1924, the Air Defense of Great Britain and the Home Defense Air Force had been slowly growing, delayed by disarmament. Then came the challenge and the lack of money of the 1930s. Yet new engines from Bristol, Rolls-Royce, and eventually Napier allowed the design and development of new types, resulting in the Hurricane, Spitfire, Defiant, Whirlwind, Whitley, Wellington, and Hampton. And in 1936, to the laying down of the design of the future heavies, the Stirling, the Halifax, and the Manchester Lancaster. The Manchester was a failure. It had two Rolls-Royce Vulture engines, and they were not reliable, and when one failed, the aircraft would roll on its back. Those latter, not to be operational till 1942 or after, takeoff weight rose from 6,000 pounds for fighters to 68,000 pounds for the normal heavies, and all metal construction, hydraulics and electrics, and in bombers, radios were all included. Aircraft requirements meant that the observer in 1942 was changed to navigator. Flight engineer was added and gunners reintroduced in 1938, and all these people got new half-wing badges. And there was a severe shortage of ground crew. which had to be met by vastly increased establishments at home and overseas, and the opening of new trades and a variety of mechanics, including radar specialists from the heavily underdeveloped industry. The RAF, by 1934, had been thoroughly impregnated with the legacy of the father of the Royal Air Force, RAF Marshal of the RAF Lord Trenchard, whose personality, philosophy, and personal bravery were the criteria. The Victorian colonial ideas of honor and valor, and especially in the spirit of the offensive, were stressed. The vast majority of field officers had been personally known to Trenchard from the Western Front. He had handpicked them and for the same qualifications. Hugh Dowding had been sent home in 1917 because, as a higher commander in the Royal Flying Corps, he had argued against the bloody policy of sending new fledglings with a bit over 15 hours, all told, against well-trained Germans. Chief of the Air Staff Trenchard basically never forgave him, and after his retirement from the RAF, Marshal of the RAF Trenchard, as Marshal of the RAF, was so egotistical as to nominate himself as Commander-in-Chief of the British Armed Forces. However, he never got the opportunity. But his reputation and influence lived on in Marshal of the RAF, Sir John Slessor, who I think was the last of his protégés to make it to Chief of the Air Staff in 1956. The RAF was lucky in that the Munich Crisis of September 1938 allowed a year's extra time for preparation. This included a lessons learned review and more exercises using the new radar, and then after the German conquest of Poland, the days of the Phony War from September to 10th of May 1940. Then in May and June 1940, Hitler, the Wehrmacht, and the Luftwaffe turned the world upside down from northern Norway to southern France. At the same time, the House of Commons in London recognized the need for new leadership, and Prime Minister Chamberlain, the indecisive, was succeeded by Churchill, the warlord. But back in 1934 had come many challenges to the air staff. In the first place, many of the officers were only accustomed to working half a day. Only 4 had had staff experience in the Great War, and some had reached wing commander, the equivalent of a lieutenant colonel, without ever having to hold an administrative post. They would have been handled by senior NCOs. In fact, one Air Chief Marshal in his memoirs mentions the fact that he was sent to be the umpire of an air exercise, and he had to ask the corporal in the office what he was supposed to do. And as if that was not enough, the challenge to personnel in the world's most elite flying club was that they were now faced with Germans turning the world of preconceived ideas upside down in both air defense and fighter command, and in the assumptions about testing guns and harmonizing of gunnery, and were muzzled by 1918 prejudices and presumptions as to project and rate of fire. In 1918, for instance, the SE-5As fought effectively at 15 to 20 yards. But by the 1930s, the single-seater monoplanes aimed to fire at over 600. And I've tried to get from my ophthalmologist an idea of the size image at 600 yards. So how could you aim at something it turns out you really couldn't see? Then during the trials of bomber versus fighter, with Hawker Demons and similar airs of the Brisfit of 1917 were pitted against the new turreted Wellington bombers, and the results favored the latter. The air staff was entirely misled, self-deluded, Oh, the 1934 corkscrew bomber defensive tactic, which I'm now trying to find out its origin, was effective to 1945. By the summer of 1939, the three principal air arms, French, German, and British, had been created for very different purposes, each of which had its origins in the needs of 1918 and the interwar policies of its then parent. The Armée de l'Air, for instance, like the RAF, claimed in 1918 to be the largest air force in the world, and meanwhile, like its then ally, was primarily an army cooperation, artillery spotting, and trench-busting weapon that had fallen on hard political times by 1939. It had lost its way and its credits, and behind the fortified trench of the Maginot Line, which didn't extend all the way to the sea, the esprit de corps of the French Air Force was wrapped in the poilu's lethargy, and its cavalry spirit, technically superior, but had too few chars blindés or tanks. The Armée de l'Air was the handmaiden of a ground-based Armée de Terre, but it lacked a recent enough doctrinal agreement to have a trained corps and reserve. If the Armée de l'Air was a continental mess perched on the shoulders of soldiers who believed that the next war would start in 1918 again, its next opponent was, both on the ground and in the air, the Wehrmacht and the Luftwaffe, masked with elite, self-motivated, tough youngsters, supervised by World War I experienced officers of the great General Staff. They had the advantage that they had used the then lost years of the 1920s, when they were not allowed to have an army, to calculate, design, test, and construct entirely new ground forces flak and aircraft. The fatal flaw, in their view, was their blitzkrieg would be a short war whose wastage and consumption could be replaced once the fighting stopped. Of the three opponents in the summer of 1940, the third, the RAF, far from muddling through, scored with a bit of luck extra points. Not now remembered as the 1 million copy official paperback, which decided that the Battle of Britain had been won by the British without even mentioning Dowding or Park. How did this happen? The Air Ministry was instructed to take advantage of the new publishing in paperback just devised by Penguin in 1940, but apparently the Air Staff, by plans or oversight, failed to recognize the important role played by Dowding and Park. More on this later. What really paid off for the RAF was pre-war planning, financing, and technological manufacturing and repair know-how, together with single-mindedness of purpose and supporting government, though fighting doctrine was still uninformed. After the Polish campaign, Hitler's forces undertook a thorough review and then planned the 1940, originally 1939, blitzkrieg. Fall 1939 was too soon, and thus the so-called Phony War. The Luftwaffe was highly active in the period while the French snoozed, fully confident that the next campaign would be 1918 all over again, and the British trained and dug in. The Allied complacency was destroyed in 46 days in 1940. During the Phony War, the RAF's Advanced Air Striking Force in mid-France tried to train. In the north, the Hurricanes and Lysanders of the air component of the British Expeditionary Force trained or flew defensive patrols and gathered intelligence. Some radar was set up, but it was primitive, and as noted, the French had none. Early in the morning of 10th May, the Germans made a surprise attack in spite of warnings, unbelieved by the Allied staff. In no time, the enemy had crossed the Meuse, whose bridges the Allies still hoped to break. But the several days' attempt to destroy them was a disaster for the clumsy, ill-armed ferry battles. They lost 67% of the force in 3 days to Luftwaffe Me-109 and Me-110s, and to concentrated flak, where they flew on the deck or at the standard 12,000 feet. The British had way underestimated German flak, and so had the French. The Germans had developed intensely because they knew what was going to come. In the meantime, the RAF's Bristol Blenheim 4s on photo reconnaissance and the Western Lysanders of Army Cooperation sorties were also rendered useless by losses. The RAF should have been warned by the Battle of Heligoland Bight on the 18th of December 1939. The experience had been ignored because the High Command refused to listen to the truth of the service survivors' debriefing. The losses were not due to poor formation flying or pilot error, the usual bogey. Later in May, when escorting Blenheim bombers were tried and they resulted in no losses, the air staff contrarily said that that proved that escorts were not needed. Over Belgium and France in May 1940, ferry pilots were posted on landing to fighter squadrons to whom they were bringing replacement aircraft. And since they had no real training, they were very quickly shot down, and the squadrons were no better off. In fact, the squadrons were extremely fatigued. And this caused, by the end of May, the withdrawal to the United Kingdom, the advanced air striking force, with borrowed French transport, retreated south and west, and by the end of May, British Air Forces France essentially had become evacuated. The Army de l'Air could surrender on the 24th of June, with many, after many flew safely to North Africa. Meanwhile, at the end of May, the RAF at home had patrolled and become worn out over the evacuation of the British Air Expeditionary Force from Dunkirk. Air Chief Marshal Sir Hugh Dowding, the AOC&C of Fighter Command, was a scientifically minded officer who moved from 1930 on the Air Council and in mid-1936 had ascended to Fighter Command. He had a well-prepared organization for the coming defense of Great Britain. One of the most important steps he had taken in May 1940 to force the cabinet, by using his operational research people, to realize that France was finished and that Britain would be next. So his courageous actions stopped the impetuous Churchill from squandering to the Army de l'Air Fighter Command's precious legacy of pilots and 43 fighter squadrons. So by 15th of August 1940, when the battle really began, Dowding had 924 officer pilots plus 300 NCO pilots, who are usually not counted, manning 570 Hurricanes and Spitfires and a few other minor types. Supported by streamlined radar-backed command and control system, a functioning, secure supply network, and a solid aircraft industry, as well as the cooperation of General Sir Frederick Pyle, his friend and Pyle's anti-aircraft command, Dowding was able to be successful. His control network was that 5 minutes after the notification of an incoming raid, his fighters were scrambled under radio discipline and direction and were climbing to 20,000 feet, which they reached in 10 minutes. The difference between the Battle of Britain and the Battle of France were not so great as they were significant, as I've noted in Unflinching Zeal. Fighter Command did not have to try to protect the Army. It had an assured POL supply, the French had burned theirs right away, adequate replenishment and delivery of needed machines and pilots, and the solution for the idle Army was to repair bombed airfields had been agreed. Moreover, Fighter Command on 10th July started with 54 squadrons with 972 aircraft that were 75% serviceable, versus the Army de l'Air on the 10th of May, which had 637 fighter aircraft, with only 30% serviceable, and the French Air Force lacked radios, command and control, and fuel. The Battle of Britain began early on in July with attacks on the Channel convoys, but the real contest commenced on 15th of August, so-called Eagle Day, with Goering expecting a walkover in 4 days. The second intensive phase began on 24th of August and climaxed on the 6th of September. The third phase lasted from 7th of September to the end of October 1940. The Luftwaffe employed about 2.5 fighters to escort each bomber, causing both the RAF and the German Air Force to use about 36.5 sorties per kill. On the other hand, the RAF had few write-offs, with 45.9% of those aircraft being brought down, being repairable. In contrast, the Luftwaffe only had 7% repairables in the Battle of Britain versus 22% in the Battle of France, because losses over France, or over Britain and over water, were not replaceable, though often the aircrew was saved by air-sea rescue. In the end, the Battle of Britain, the RAF lost 792 aircraft to the German 1,407. Both sides picked the wrong targets. Convoys were small fry, though defending them put hours on RAF fighters and fatigued their pilots, but left radar sites, airfields, aircraft factories untouched. For the RAF, the fact that Dowding did not control number 2 bomber command group meant he lacked the light bombers to use against the 50 German airfields within range. On the other hand, the Air Ministry totally overestimated the revived strength of the German Air Force at 14,000 aircraft, until in spring 1941, Churchill, as Prime Minister, asked Justice Singleton to look into the matter, and he reduced that estimate to 5,000 of all types. Already, in fact, the number of ME-109s had been reduced from 906 on 1st of June to 673 in early November. So when the RAF had 1,796 pilots available for more than 55 squadrons of Hurricanes and Spitfires, and in the matter of use of radar, Germans suffered from the same double blindness as the RAF. They assumed that the enemy thought like themselves and was also less capable. That's not an uncommon military problem. Critical to the outcome of the Battle of Britain was the German Air Force Hugo Sperl losing the argument to attack the vital airfields to Kesselring on Goering's decision to strike London. This was the triumph for the interwar air menace schools thesis that civilian morale would crack under bombing. As noted in both Two Roads and in my Why Air Forces Fail, the Anatomy of Defeat, the Germans switched targets from airfields to London coincided with Dowding's manpower decision to reinforce Keith Park's number 11 group only with suitable individual pilots and not with whole squadrons. In the air, the German Air Force ME-109, with its fuel injection Daimler-Benz inline engine, could bunt into a dive trailing smoke, while the Merlin engine RAF monoplanes suffered momentary fuel exhaustion when they followed suit. There was also the vulnerable German bombers' defense to the rear. It was not that the engine provided protection to the pursuing pilot, but that the glycol coolant tank on the Merlin was located above the front of the engine, and one bullet through it would fill the cockpit with steam. British fighters also had the wrong guns. The 1,200 round per minute American Browning shot a lightweight bullet that was not very effective at 400 yards. The range that RAF pilots opened fire. It was effective at 250 yards. However, the ME-109's cannon was lethal out to 800 yards. RAF pilots viewed the 1930s Air Staff anti-bomber formal area attack VIC formation as fruits of ignorance, and instructions to harmonize guns at shotgun pattern as simply ineffective and wasteful, preferring instead the lethal concentration of bullets at 250 yards. But at least this was not as caustic as the 1935 group captain's comment that the 12 aircraft in line abreast, the standard formation of the day, was a complete waste of ammunition, as no one in the formation could hear anybody else firing, let alone those of the leader. It looked great as the annual Hendon Air Show, but it was hardly war. In the aftermath of the battle and smelling of Air Ministry politics, Air Vice Marshal Keith Park of No. 11 Group was dispatched to Training Command and ultimately to defend Malta. He was succeeded by Air Vice Marshal Leigh Mallory as Air Officer Commanding. Air Chief Marshal Lord Dowding was quickly sent on an exile mission to the United States in late 1940 and was succeeded by Air Vice Marshal Sholto Douglas, Deputy Chief of the Air Staff, who falsely claimed that there was no politics in the appointment. He had been on the discussions with Beta. He also had been involved in that. Prime Minister Churchill subsequently wrote to the Secretary of State for Air, Sir Archibald Sinclair, that the handling of Dowding's retirement was disgraceful, and it was. Finally, Dowding, the victor of the Battle of Britain, considered by outsiders the equivalent of Trafalgar in 1805 and Waterloo in 1815, was, I believe, and I haven't been able to verify this, was posthumously created a Marshal of the Royal Air Force, a rank which the Air Ministry claimed had hitherto been reserved for retired chiefs of the Air Staff. In Battle of Britain combat, because altitude was an advantage, RAF fighter squadrons expected to be airborne within 3 minutes in order to scramble on the command received by telephone from Sector Command. A 12-aircraft formation in 4 VICs of 3 expected to reach 20,000 feet in 9 minutes, and with Hurricanes vectored to the bombers and Spitfires opposing the ME-109s as they fought from a superior altitude. But not until mid-August 1940 did the British abandon the VIC and adopt the finger 4 of 2 pairs, which the Germans had learned in Spain during the 1936-39 Civil War. Then the odds were evened. Luftwaffe escorts were limited, as you know, to just minutes over London because of their too little fuel, while Fighter Command's machine had only 55 minutes at full throttle from takeoff to landing and back again. 300 rounds of .303 carried for each of the 8 guns gave 15 seconds of firepower, but as pre-war it was reckoned that enemy aircraft would only be in the opponent's sight for 2 seconds, and 300 rounds per gun was deemed sufficient. But as noted earlier, even with 8 guns, it was not effective against all metal armored aircraft unless closer than 250 yards. With the 8-gun fighter on the drawing boards, the Air Staff from 1931 had to undertake progressive study of air tactics. This was hampered by the fact that the air units had to be air trials had to be carried out with 2-seat biplanes, Hawker Harts and their developments from 1933, and 3 guns and a top speed of 150 miles, 5 miles an hour. In contrast, it was basically a revised Bristol fighter of 1917, 1918. In the meantime, lumbering monoplane Fairey Hendon bombers and biplane Handley Page Hayford fighters were cruising at 150 miles an hour, armed bomber command. They were superseded by the Armstrong with Whitley and the Vickers Wellington, both defended by power turrets. The former cruised at 60 miles an hour, and the latter at over 200. Until late in 1937, experimental exercises often included only a pair of aircraft and were not very productive. So by 1940, the RAF had yet no established real fighter or bomber doctrine. Luckily, the experienced and still piloting Keith Park of No. 11 Group had been a fighter commander in 1918. The same could not be said of Trafford Leigh-Mallory or his No. 12 Group, and so began the big wing controversy when in September of 1940, Park asked for No. 12 Group to cover his airfields. Leigh-Mallory saw little reason for urgency. He had been a reconnaissance pilot. Instead, he adopted the ideas of the legless Douglas Bader and formed 3 squadrons into big wings or balboes. These ponderous formations, according to Park, on 32 occasions did form only found enemy aircraft in 7 and only shot down 1. In contrast, No. 11 Group pointed out that they had shot down 211. Air staff politics played a part up to Dowding's exile to the United States in November to tell the Americans about the battle. 2 minor comments must be made here. First, Dowding did not have access to the important Enigma cipher decryptions, only to current Luftwaffe operational conversations. And second, Australian Sidney Cam, a sort of a renegade, had only 2 light blue photographic reconnaissance Spitfires at the time of the battle. And they were unarmed and flew at high altitude. One of the interesting things they did discover were contrails, which they had not been flying high enough before to get to. I'm not going to describe the 43 days of the Battle of Britain. The book on the reading list covers that. So in the remainder of my time, I will sum up and try to tell you what I think was important or less noticed, especially as compared and linked to the Battle of France as the Luftwaffe was the common aggressor. One significant way, the Battle of Britain was quite different from the battle 2 months earlier over France. The Armée de l'Air was almost totally unprepared. It lacked enough well-trained pilots, radar, and controllers linked to effective anti-aircraft DCA, as well as doctrine appropriate to the coming blitzkrieg. The RAF had been preparing for many occasions to meet a French threat, but importantly, it had an air member of the Air Council to oversee the required technical and scientific developments. Thus, while French engines were not advanced enough to power the new fighters of the later 1930s, the British Rolls-Royce private venture Merlin was and could be developed. Although the French had the advantage of the 3-bladed Ratier steel propellers, the British caught up by 1940. They also had the design geniuses to go from the Gloucester Gladiator of 1934 to the Gloucester Meteor or Jet of 1940. That man was the same designer. And in engines, they had the 21 100 horsepower Napier Sabre of 1938, and that designer went on to produce the de Havilland Goblin jet by 1944. These piston engines, Rolls-Royce, Bristol, and Napier power plants were then possible because of work from the 1920s on higher octane fuels and knowledge of similar work in Germany, enabling Messerschmitt to produce varieties of the Me-109 throughout the war. Though the RAF had studied from the 1920s wastage and consumption in war, and from 1936 commanders had SD-98 to guide them in planning for the Air Force, including rounds of ammunition. However, the Air Staff had many subjects to consider, and for which it had to make decisions. From 1936, the so-called Shadow Scheme and the Civilian Repair Organization are but two examples that, in connection with airfield building, required the 1940 Manpower Committee, to its creation being one of final actions of Prime Minister David Lloyd George in the First World War, to leave a legacy to the Second. A certain part of the expansion scheme of 1936 was tilted by xenophobia. The enemy would not act like the superior British, and thus the assumption that enemy fighters would not escort German Air Force bombers would always approach from astern. Opposite the enemy bombers would be also the enemy bombers would not be escorted. History now clearly shows these mental errors. By 15 September 1940, Britain was safe from the air menace, though the night blitz would last into spring 1941, when Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa into the USSR. For that gigantic struggle, it would prove the Battle of Britain's losses, together with poor production decisions, had left the Luftwaffe short of single-engine fighters. The summer of 1940 had cut German aircraft production of rebuilds from 23% to 7%. By September 1940, Luftwaffe was only 69% of what it had been on 10th May. Dowding's handling of the battle was considerably aided in that he neither had to parry the Wehrmacht nor to get Air Ministry permission to act. His communications net was almost instantaneous, and Dowding understood correctly the notion of air battle, as did Park. The training system was already being pushed before the Battle of 1939-40, resulting in an accident rate for units with the newer, heavier aircraft 4 times that of the older ones. In less complex machines, yet the end of 1940, the training establishment was producing a surplus of aircrew through a 4-week course. Goering did not understand the limits of air warfare. Naval bombers and their escorts, and of fatigue of both air and ground crew, nor did he realize the attritional aspects of supply. Created by Act of Parliament in 1917, the Royal Air Force ended the Great War as probably the largest air arm in the world. Though reduced to cadre in the 1920s, it had twin advantages of being led by 1930 by its wartime commander, and to have his post-war blueprint, his November 1919 Memorandum Command Paper CMD 467. Just a half a page to go now. For the permanent organization of the Royal Air Force, and in the later guide SD-98. In the interwar years, the RAF made technical progress and gained popular support with its air shows. However, from 1923, its new role as an offensive defensive deterrent bomber was never realized in activities focused upon, its activities being focused upon colonial control. By Trenchard's vision, the Auxiliary Air Force, the Royal Air Force Volunteer Reserve, and the Women's Royal Auxiliary Air Force provided over the years the necessary manpower to enable the RAF by 1941 to meet its goal in personnel of the level of 1918. As a result, neither home air defense nor the bomber offensive were provided the necessary war doctrine for the next war. Only in 1934 was disarmament changed to rearmament. From then on, practical changes were made and new aircraft types produced. Neither would become operational until 1939, 1941. Command, control, and communications existed in 1918 with fighter command melding new tactics onto the old ladder. That, the infrastructure, the aircraft and repair industries provided a just sufficient sinews of defensive war. To this must be added the influence of certain leading personalities, Trenchard, Dowding, Park, and the Secretary of State for Air, not touched upon here, and of British national characteristics. Thank you.
Never in the history of human conflict has so much been owed by so many to so few. Who said that? Who is he talking about? That's true, but I just said it. And I'm talking about your men and women in uniform today. Less than 1% of Americans are in uniform, and they've been at war for over 20 years. I got to say this because I love every one of them. I had the privilege to deploy with them in 2007 in Operation Iraqi Freedom. First half of this year, I deployed to Operation Enduring Freedom. And I got to tell you something. Americans don't know what's going on, because not only have they been at it for over 20 years, and they're few and far between, their resources are being cut. One of the squadrons I'm going to talk about tonight had to sit down for 6 months this year, grounded, sequestration, to save money. Now, these are the tip of the spear of your military, and because of sequestration, they had to sit down. Now, think about you guys who fought in World War II, God bless you. World War II, we put over 20 million Americans in uniform. They went to war, they won the war, they came home, and they were our greatest generation. The men and women who are fighting your wars of today, they go to war. And then they come home, and guess what? They're getting ready to go back. And then they go to war, and then they come home, and then they go back. I gave a speech over there, and first thing I did was I said, okay, who's deployed once, twice, 3 times? I got up to 20, and I still had hands in the air. Think about that. Try raising a family when you're back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. I have a lieutenant colonel who I work with who, while he was deployed, his career handler contacted him and said, okay, your next assignment. No, and his deployment was a 1-year deployment. He said, your next assignment is I'm sending you on a remote for a year. And the colonel said, do you know where I am now? Well, yeah. What are you doing? Well, we need you over there. Without his family, again. And the colonel said, I'm done putting my papers in. I can't do this. I've got kids. I can't do it. So the reason I'm starting off by sharing this with you is, as Americans, you need to know this, because this is your military. This is your young men and women who are sacrificing. And if things don't change, it's not going to be pretty, because eventually people like that who deploy again and again and again, as much as they love this country, and they do, and as hard as they work, and they do, they get burned out. So I just had to share that with you before I jump off here. Thank you. But anything you can do to support these guys and gals, nothing is too much. They are the most amazing people. It's such a privilege to serve with them. Eagle Squadrons, Yanks in the RAF, you just heard about the Battle of Britain. What's going on back home? Well, back home, we're at peace, you know, and we're still pissed off from World War I. You know, we're supposed to save the world, and they're at it again. But we've got Americans who are seeing what's going on over there, and they're like, you know something? I'm getting into that. Now, they had a lot of reasons. A lot of it was pure love of freedom, because this was good guys against bad guys. You know, you didn't have to take a poll, you know, let me see, Syria, let me see the rebels, who do we want to support? No, Nazis, Englishmen, yeah, I want to fight with the Englishmen. So we had Americans who wanted to go over and join them. Now, a lot of them couldn't fly for us because you had to have a college degree. And a lot of these guys didn't have a college degree. Some of them couldn't pass the physical limitations. So you had people who really wanted to fly, couldn't do it for the Army, Air Corps, the Navy, so they wanted to get over there. 7 Americans total fought in the Battle of Britain. I'm going to talk about 4 of them tonight. 3 of them you're going to learn more about: Red Tobin, Andy Mamedoff, Shorty Keogh. 4th guy grew up on a dairy farm not terribly far from here. And in a better world, his story of dedication and sacrifice would be familiar to all Americans. This is him. Arthur Gerard Donahue, born in a farm in St. Charles, Minnesota. Began flying at 15. At 19, Minnesota's youngest commercial pilot. First dogfight in the Battle of Britain was in August 1940 in RAF 6-4 Squadron. He went over there with so much flying experience, it took no time at all for him to be in the air. Now, he was assigned to 71 RAF Eagle Squadron, and I'm going to be talking more about that. But when they sent him to 71 Squadron, they were still standing up. And he said, I'm not just going to hang around while you're putting this together. I'm a combat pilot, let me back. So they sent him back to 6-4 Squadron, and then he went to Singapore in October 1941, served there, badly wounded, came back to England in 1942. 11 September 1942, 9/11. Shot down a Junkers 88 over the English Channel, but his engine was hit, and he attempted to ditch. He did. We believe he ditched in the English Channel. Body was never recovered. His words: the most that can be said for myself is that I tried and tried hard and fought hard. I did have the privilege of being numbered among the few score pilots who met the first German mass onslaughts in the air blitzkrieg against England. Of these facts, I shall always be proud, even if I fail, to add more to them. One of your guys, Minnesota boy, and didn't have to go to war. We were at peace, and he went and he fought and he died for freedom. England in the 1940s, pretty quiet, pretty peaceful. As we heard, they're gearing up for war, but for a nation that rules so much of the world, you'd never know it to look at them. England's experience of World War I was, we don't ever want to do that again. Germany's experience of World War I was, we're really pissed off and we're going to get it right the second time. Of course, Nazi Germany, just the opposite. Rearmament, parades, excitement. Germany is rising up in the world. And it's amazing because in Germany today, you can't have a painting, if there's a aviation art painting and it shows a German aircraft with a swastika on the tail, you can't sell it because God forbid somebody see what a swastika looks like. Personally, I think everybody should know everything about Hitler and the Nazis, because if you don't know what evil looks like, you don't recognize it when it comes back. And you know something? It always comes back. German Luftwaffe, great planes, great pilots. Let me throw out a statistic or some numbers for you just to give you an idea. Highest scoring American ace of all time, Dick Bong, 40 victories, okay? Highest scoring ace anywhere of all time, Eric Hartmann, 352 victories. The Germans had 100 pilots with over 100 victories. They had 12 pilots with over 200 victories and 2 pilots with over 300 victories. So these are the guys that our young men who are sitting at home fishing and playing football and, you know, going to the drive-in are thinking about, well, let's go fight those guys, okay? Royal Air Force, again, you heard from Robin this evening. Good planes, good pilots, some good plans, some good organization, but at the time of the Battle of Britain, Germans have a lot more planes, a lot more pilots. So what do they need? They need pilots, and they need them from wherever they can get them. So they come up with the idea of the Eagle Squadrons. Let's get Americans to come over to help us in our fight with the Nazis. Let's not let the fact that America is not at war yet get in the way. They could just kind of sneak over the border, sign up, we'll train them, send them to England, and off they go. So Americans kind of had to renounce their citizenship, but more importantly, they had to pledge allegiance to the British in order to do that. So that's who these guys were, from all walks of life, from all the states, different levels of experience. Some of them are crack pilots. Some of them knew nothing about flying. Tell you a quick story about one guy. Didn't even start off as an American, although he is today. A guy called Steve Pisanos was a boy growing up in Greece. Saw the Greek fighters flying overhead when he was a little kid. He's like, wow, do I want to do that? So when he got to be a little bit older, he snuck onto the base and, would sweep out the hangars and help out, do whatever he could. And finally somebody said, hey, kid, you're here every day, and thanks, but what are you doing? He goes, well, I want to be a pilot. It's like, ain't going to happen. We have a class system here, and you're not in the right class. So 18 years old, gets a job on a transport ship. When it hits Baltimore, he jumps ship, goes to New York, works in a restaurant, spends every dime taking flying lessons, and then someone says, hey, if you go into Canada, you can join the Royal Air Force and go fly Spitfires. On his way. So an example of the kind of guy that would do that. Another example, love this guy. Kid Hofer, athlete, boxer, just an all-round, all-American guy, is crossing over into Canada to just do some stuff with some friends. Had never heard of the Eagle Squadrons. And the Canadian guard official, whatever he was, sees this strapping young American. He goes, you're here for the Eagle Squadrons. And Kid Hofer looks at him and he goes, what's that? And he says, Spitfires, fight the Germans, the whole bit. And Hofer goes, where do I go? That's how he became an Eagle Squadron pilot. I got to share this while we got this with his dog. This is when he flew for the 4th Fighter Group, and we're getting to that. He would take his dog up in the plane, and he'd fly alongside another American, and he'd duck down. So they'd look over, it's, oh my God, we're not only fighting the Germans, the German Shepherds are flying our planes, But you got to love this guy. Now, the other 3 guys that I'm going to talk about, Red Tobin, Shorty Keogh, Andy Mamedoff. Red Tobin, tall guy, red hair, gave tours at MGM Studios in California, took flying lessons. Why'd they call Shorty Shorty? 4'10", and barnstormer. So not only flying, giving shows, he'd jump out of airplanes with a parachute because, back then in the 20s and 30s, that was totally cool. So he would do that. Andy Mamedoff, another barnstormer. He was from Connecticut, and first-generation American, white Russians were his parents. But these guys met on a ship going to France. They were going to fly for the French and get to France, and France is collapsing with the Blitzkrieg. Ooh, big mistake. They catch a ship to England, and they become the, 3 of the 7 who fly for the British. So their significance to us is after the Battle of Britain, they become the initial cadre of 71 squadrons. 71 squadrons, the first Eagle Squadron. They start talking about it in July. It's not really until September, October 1940 that these guys get planes and the whole bit, and they're put into action. All 3 of those guys had at least 1 kill in the Battle of Britain. They're all credited with shooting down a bomber. Now, 4'10", size 5 shoes. Shorty, flying out of Curtin and Lindsay, one of the RAF bases that they were based at. The day before it's his day, 2 of the planes collide. And the one plane is not badly hurt, but the other plane is very badly hurt. And Shorty follows it all the way down, screaming, get out, jump out, but the pilot couldn't, and lost the pilot. The next day, they had a mission over France, and on the way back, Shorty's plane just did a slow descent into the English Channel with, again, people screaming, Shorty, Shorty. The post-accident report said his oxygen wasn't working properly, and he just passed out. So he was the first of the 3 to be lost. This is February 1941 that we lose Shorty. Red Tobin, again, like I said, had a bomber kill in the Battle of Britain. September 1941, 71 Squadron gets attacked by a gaggle of Me-109s, lose 3, including Red. So Red is killed in September 1941. Andy Mammonoff, really kind of sad, because Andy married a British girl. And when he married her, 71 Squadron buzzed the town, causing all kinds of disturbance, but why not? He went to 133 Squadron, that's the 3rd of the Eagle Squadrons, and they were transferring to Northern Ireland for training, and really bad weather, so they tried to put down in the Isle of Man. 4 planes flew into a mountainside, including Andy's. So it's only October 1941, and all 3 of these guys are gone. We're not even in the war yet, and these guys are gone. When I've talked about the Eagle Squadrons previously, I would always say they had a 45% casualty rate, 45% chance, killed, captured, wounded. Well, that's not a good number, because 25% of these guys died getting their wings in accidents and weather and the whole shebang. So you lose 25%, then you lose 45%. So there's a less than even chance that these guys are gonna make it out of here alive. 2nd Eagle Squadron, 121 Eagle Squadron, that was stood up in May 41 at Curtin and Lindsay. The most famous thing they did as a squadron was, if anybody's ever heard of the Channel Dash, when the British Navy decided we're going back home, let's just take a shortcut through the English Channel, caught the RAF and the Royal Navy flat-footed. They're one of the squadrons that responded and helped do some damage to the German Navy. 133 Squadron are put up 1 August 41 at RAF base Coltis Hall. Now, I had to go back because I just had to share this with you. When Shorty, when they had a mission and Shorty had to run to his Spitfire, he would race out to his Spitfire with a big pillow under each arm. Because he was so short, he had to sit on 2 pillows in order to see out of the cockpit. Now, when he went down, Air Sea Rescue found wreckage. And people go, oh, did they find the pillows? Didn't find the pillows, but they found size 5 shoes. He's the only guy in the Royal Air Force wearing size 5 shoes, so they found the wreckage that that would have been from Shorty. Don't know why that's not low now. There it goes. Okay. So, and again, a giant of a man in size 5 shoes. 7 December, Pearl Harbor's attacked. Now we're in it. So we've got 3 squadrons of Americans, and we're in the war. So what are we going to do with them? Well, 8th Air Force is putting together an Air Force in Europe, and they go, hey, let's grab these guys and build a cadre of fighter squadrons, you know, take a handful from each, spread them out. The only trouble was our guys said, ain't gonna do it. We're staying together. So that's what happened. Let me digress to, I guess this was 2012, pardon me. This is Captain Ditch Suppa, 335 Squadron from the 121 Squadron. We had an event on base and having to do with the Eagle Squadrons and the Battle of Britain. I'll tell you about it in the next slide. And Ditch looked at me and he said, Doc, I don't think I could have done it. And I said, couldn't have done what? He said, I couldn't have done what these guys did. You know, leave my family, leave my country, go overseas and fight for another country. I mean, even in this great cause, I don't think I could have done it. Well, this is a guy who, I can't even tell you how many tours he's flown in Iraq and Afghanistan and places I can't talk about, and how many medals this guy has. I mean, this guy is a true American hero. And he said this to me, and as God is my witness, I don't know why, my brain was working that night. And I looked at him and I said, Ditch, do you know where the heart of the Eagle Squadrons lives today? And he kind of shook his head, and I thumped his chest. I said, right there. And I believe it. These guys and gals in the 4th Fighter Wing carry on these traditions each and every day. Last Friday, we celebrated the Battle of Britain at Seymour Johnson Air Force Base. Do it every year. How do we celebrate? Well, 6 of the squadrons get pianos, and they bring them to the Spitfire pub, decorated up and the whole bit, and the wing commander and everybody else is out there, and the wing commander goes, okay, we'll save those two for the fire, and those 2 are for feats of human strength and endurance. So 2 of them are immediately doused in flames. The feats of human strength and endurance are the pilots take sledgehammers to them, and every piece of the piano has to pass through a toilet seat. I feel bad for these guys the next day, you know, but, and then of course they get thrown on the fire, and I think this last time, all 6 wound up on the fire. Now, does anybody know why we do this? There's lots of stories, and I'm just going to tell you one, because this is the one that I think holds the most validity. During the Battle of Britain, and let's face it, going up against the Germans day in and day out, mission after mission after mission is tough stuff. Well, one of the squadrons had a piano player, and every night they'd come back and he'd be playing away, and he would sort of take their minds off of combat and life and death and all the horrors of war that they were experiencing. Well, of course, you know what happened. One day they come back from battle and piano player's gone. He's lost. So they're just sitting there in the club, and they're looking at the piano, and they're not feeling good about it. And finally the squadron commander goes, take the damn thing out and burn it. That's what they did. That's how they dealt with it. The 3 Eagle Squadrons become the 4th Fighter Group, the current 4th Fighter Wing, in September 1942. 71 Squadron becomes 334, American Fighter Squadron. 121 Squadron becomes the 335 Fighter Squadron, the Chiefs. 133 becomes the 336 Fighter Squadron, the Rocketeers. Now, that emblem wasn't developed until the Korean War when we actually had jets. But that's the legacy, that's the lineage. Well, what happened to the 4th Fighter Wing after the Eagle Squadrons? Well, the 4th Fighter Group in World War II destroyed 1,016 German aircraft. Not bad. The most ever by any wing or group in any war. Nobody's ever going to beat that. 81 aces in World War II. That's a lot. Korean War, our one wing destroyed more MiGs than the entire rest of the Air Force combined. Again, that's never going to happen again. Served honorably in Vietnam, and these guys led the fight in Desert Storm, and since then have been the pointy end of the spear in Iraq and Afghanistan. In, I guess it was 2012, I think, when you deploy it, so you lose track. The Air Force Foundation came up with the Doolittle Award to give to a wing or a group with the greatest heritage. Now, what's so cool is they just called us and said, "Gotta be you." Okay, great. So we got the first Doolittle Award as the wing with the greatest heritage. The trouble was the next year, all the other Air Force historians are calling me going, "Hey, how did you do it? You know, did you have to submit an essay, or did you have to give them statistics, or?" Well, no, I had to answer the phone. So, sorry. But that's just an example of what an extraordinary wing this is. This is the sign. Oops, didn't want to do that. Can I get that back? Okay. There it is. This sign right here. You can't read it, but this is the Eagle Squadron logo, and this says home of the RAF Eagle Squadrons. This is the main entrance to our base. And of course, this is what we fly today, the F-15E Strike Eagle. This is the F-4 Phantom that we used to fly. This is a full-scale replica Spitfire that we have outside the Spitfire pub, and XRD. And what's significant about that is the first American ace of World War I was a young man by the name of William Dunn, 71 Eagle Squadron. That's the markings of his plane. So when you drive onto Seymour Johnson today, that's the first airplane you see, which is the wing commander grabbed me and said, "Yo, Doc, I want a Spitfire." And I mean, you normally get aircraft from the National Museum of the Air Force. They don't have any Spitfires. So I found a company in Cornwall, England, that builds full-scale replicas. And they built it for a fraction of the cost of any American company. And I even found out there was an American company who was trying to bid on this, who was going to buy it from the same guys, hoping we hadn't found them, and charge us about 5 times as much. So fortunately, I found these guys. So another, I got to share this because it's too cool. It's my wife's Spitfire, because when the guys came over and installed it, she and I were there till midnight. She was the only one taking pictures. Public Affairs had long gone to bed. And we entertained these guys all week long. So she knew everything about this plane. Before I deployed, I'm down in South Carolina undergoing training. I'm in a building where I can't even bring a cell phone because it's all classified. A 4-star general visits the base, and the wing commander, Colonel Jeannie Levitt, is giving him a tour, and he sees the Spitfire and he goes, "Hey, wow, tell me all about that." And she goes, "I'll get back to you on that, sir." And then they're looking for me, and they can't find me. Protocol gets a hold of my wife, and "We got to get Doc. Where is he? We got to get Doc." And she goes, he's not available. What do you need?" "We need to know about the Spitfire." And my wife's like, "Hey, what do you want to know?" So my wife saved the day. She knew everything there was to know. And what's even better is I was given a direct verbal order that when the new wing commander came in, I was not allowed to talk to her about any more planes because we have no money. None. So, okay, I promise. Well, with my wife's business, Colonel Levitt was signing prints. And Colonel Levitt said to my wife, "Hey, do you know what other planes we need?" And Judine is like, "Yeah, I think my husband said a P-47 and maybe a Hurricane," and I'm off the hook. She did it, I didn't, so I love it. I love my wife. She's amazing. Oh, and while I think of it, anybody who buys a print tonight, $5 goes to your new fund. But you can't tell my wife, okay? It's the only thing. Like I said, the spirit of these guys is alive and well. Great, 12 O'Clock High, all the other great World War II movies. We've got 1,000 B-17s in the air and maybe 500 P-51s. 4 F-15E Strike Eagles can do the same job that 1,500 of those planes could do. That's how extraordinary they are. This is what I was telling you about. This is Afghanistan, everything, but then if you look in the reflection, that's an Eagle Squadron Spitfire, uniforms, the Jeep, the hangars, the whole shebang. So we were working with an artist over in England to try to capture the flavor of our heritage, and we think with this he really nailed it. So that's who we are. That's where we came from. And like I said, any opportunity that you have, whether you're writing your normal letter to your congressman or having a council meeting, whatever, our young men and women today need better support than they're getting. We owe it to them. So whatever you can do to make that happen, please do, and God bless you.
Well, I am a stand-in tonight, and it is my great good fortune over the past few months to have interviewed a lovely lady, a 90-year young lady, in fact, who came over to this country in 1946 as a British war bride. Beryl met and married Thomas Rettinger while they were both serving in the military in England. Tom was an 8th Air Force man with the 52nd Fighter Control Squadron, and Beryl was a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, the RAF. We heard a little bit about that earlier from Robin, too. Well, I am a stand-in tonight. She couldn't be here, unfortunately. So she asked me, because I've been doing some interviewing with her in the last few months, if I would just tell a little bit about what she did during the Battle of Britain, where she was, and just give you a little flavor of what life was like in the early years of the war for Britain to begin with in 1939. Well, as we know, Britain found itself again on September 3rd, 1939, in yet another world war, one that they didn't really want to be in. At that time, Beryl Rettinger was 17 years old, and the government had suggested, highly, that families start to move out and away from England. And Beryl and her family lived in Wimbledon, which is quite close to the heart of England. So they did. Beryl and her mother and their nanny and Beryl's sisters moved a little bit north to get away from the impending war that they believed was coming to their country. Beryl's father was able to stay in their home in Wimbledon because he had a job where he traveled around the country. However, after being away from their home for a few months, by the spring and early summer of 1940, and we talked about the Phony War, was kind of complacent, and families started to move back to their homes in London, and that's exactly what Beryl's family did. Well, consequently, within 2-3 months, the Battle of Britain ensued, and they were literally in the middle of it. However, during the time that Beryl and her family were gone, Beryl's father built a bomb shelter literally in the central hallway of their home, their 2-story home. And she said night after night after night, the mattresses came out because that's where the entire family slept every night for months on end. Beryl recalls her mother standing in the window during a particular attack and pulling back the blackout curtain and watching afar as she could see the blazes and the bombings. And Beryl said she will never forget that, even as just a teenager, her mother watching the battle from their home. Fortunately, the family's home was not damaged. And by 1941, Beryl turned 18, and all British young women were required to register for service, and that's exactly what she did in the summer of 1941. 1 year later, the summer of 1942, she was in active duty, and at the age of 19, she became a member of the Women's Auxiliary Air Force, which is actually part of, came from World War I and part of the RAF. And Beryl has written just a few comments here that I just want to give you a flavor, because she really tells you what it was like, her as a 19-year-old woman in the RAF, essentially. And this is what Beryl has to say. She says, "We traveled by lorries to train stations to our destination camps to be inducted into the WAAFs. We were given uniforms, great coats, shoes, uncomfortable though, because I got blisters from doing our foot training and marching. We also got rain capes, uniforms, caps, shirts, ties, all other necessities, and a kit bag to carry it all in over the shoulder. We spent about 3 weeks learning all this, plus how to salute, make beds the military way, and eventually we were weeded out, we took tests, and again sent to various camps for more detailed training. I was sent to Cranwell, and again, Robin mentioned that too, which was the top training for fighter pilots in World War II. There, she learned RDF, radio direction finding. She stayed there for several months learning this. She lived in a barracks hut, marched everywhere, cookhouse 3 times a day, had to line up in the parade ground, marched to all classes, gas drills, bomb drills, was a nervous wreck trying to learn all about the signals sent by our radio sets and so forth. Also had to learn the Morse code and how to use the Aldous lamp. Was a hard course for girls not used to this type of knowledge. Some RAF instructors were kind and considerate. Others resented us learning to do a man's job, and they were not so kind to us. What they didn't understand is we were learning to do this job to relieve the men for other duties overseas. I was sent to several different camps before ending up at Manston, which is in the southeast of London, very, very near the Channel. Here I was issued my battle dress for the duties at the RDF Tower, and also a bike to use for transportation. We had to sign in and out of the guard room. The buildup was everywhere, with Allied forces preparing for the big invasion, which of course was D-Day. Lots of activities, lots of restrictions, very few cars on the road, mostly military, convoys and so on. Service personnel did a lot of hitchhiking to get places. All public transportation curtailed. When we went on night duty, we had to go to the cookhouse and collect our rations for the night. Just 2 of us on duty at a time. We had no protection against invaders, no protection against parachutists, no protection against the buzz bombs or the doodle bugs. They heard the dog fights overhead all the time. Farmers working in the fields with tractors caused interference with our radio signals. We often had to run over to the fields to get their attention, to stop working, which was of course not very popular. Often lines were cut and we had communication op controllers, and they were not pleased. Had to have RAF personnel out from Manston to replace. The lines were not buried very deep. So those were Beryl's words. What exactly was an RDF person? And what was their job? Essentially, her job as an RDF person was to aid in the air-sea rescue of pilots in distress over the English Channel. And how was that accomplished? Well, it was pretty much manual compared to our electronics today, and it was pretty basic, but it did get the job done. In order to locate and get a fix on a pilot in distress, they used pretty much a 3-station system. Essentially 3 small wooden buildings or huts. They were so small that she said they could hardly, the 2 of them, move around in this little hut. They were set out away from the base proper, and the ideal location for these 3 little huts in this unit was the middle of a farmer's field, as we heard from her notation. Each DF, or directing finding station, had an antenna out of the roof, which have to be rotated, of course, to hone in on these direction finding. Inside the station, the antenna pole was controlled essentially by a steering wheel. And Beryl said inside the steering wheel mechanism was a disc which she would push as she's turning the steering wheel to pick up the voices of the RAF pilots that were in distress. And she said once she heard the voice, it had to be the lower pitch voice. It couldn't be the high, louder pitch. It had to be the lower pitch, and then she knew she had the fix. As soon as she did get this coordinate, it was phoned in immediately to the base aerodrome control tower. Then it was immediately handed over to the plotting room, where they would put the string. Once they heard from all 3 little huts, they had their coordinate. Wherever the 3 strings from the 3 huts intercepted was exactly where air-sea rescue would be sent, because that was the point that they needed to find. Beryl recalled with sadness and tears when she remembered the voices of some of these distressed pilots. She said there was nothing they could do, just listen to try to get the coordinate and pass on the information as soon as they possibly could to save the flyboy's life. She also remembered a call she got once from the main tower to congratulate her on a rescue that was made from her coordinate alone. Usually they would have to have the 3 coordinates to pinpoint the exact location of the pilot. However, the other 2 huts could not get the voice. So they went with her coordinate, and sure enough, they were able to rescue the pilot. That's something she's very proud of. And she has much to be proud of. Her courage in serving her country during this time in England, in the early days of World War II, and her willingness to tell us the story is very, very wonderful, so that we can all remember why exactly we do have the peace and the freedom that we have today because of people like Beryl. Thank you.
Thank you, Mary. The story that also needs to be told, when a pilot was in distress, he would hit a separate frequency, which would then come back. Are there any questions? Any questions here? Well, I have one. When you were talking about the organization of the RAF, you talked about a coastal command. Mm-hmm. Was that the seaplanes? Grab the mic.
Well,
grab the mic.
Yeah. Yeah. Coastal Command had both land planes and flying boats. There really were very few seaplanes. Its general job was to patrol down the Bay of Biscay, the western approaches to the Bristol Channel at the south end of Ireland, and the northern channel around between Scotland and Northern Ireland. Its best known plane probably was the short Sunderland, and it could take a patrol about 9 to 12 hours. They did also use American Consolidated Catalinas, and all these planes were, in the latter part of the war, were painted white below and sea gray above.
But those were part of the RAF, not part of the Navy.
Oh no, that was, there'd been a long fight between 1924 and 1937 over control of the so-called Fleet Air Arm, which were RAF airplanes that operated off aircraft carriers and shore stations. But that had been resolved in 37, and so the Fleet Air Arm was a totally separate operation under the Admiralty.
Doc, are there any of the Eagle Squadron still living?
Very few. Steve Pisanos is still living, the gentleman who I talked about from Greece. He lives in San Diego. And I had a bunch of school kids come over from Curtin and Lindsay 2 years ago doing research, and we had a teleconference with him, and the kids were just delighted because he was, you know, an actual Eagle Squadron guy that they could ask questions to, and he still, even his early 90s, is full of enthusiasm. So he's still going strong, but there's not many. Even the 4th Fighter Group, they ceased their reunions as of about a year ago. There's just not enough people left. So as you all know, it's really sad. Our greatest generation is rapidly departing.
Question here.
Maybe you mentioned this when you first started talking, Doc, but what exactly did you do? Were you in the military at these bases, or are you a consultant?
I'm a GS civilian for the Air Force. But when I was hired, I agreed that I'm willing to be what they call an emergency essential civilian, meaning that I deploy, they can deploy me as often as the active duty if they want. And what happens is I am a trained historian. I will be a historian for a deployed wing. And while there, just do whatever I can do to support the wing in any capacity. So that's basically what it is. And it's funny because I get over there and people are like, "You're a civilian, why are you here?" So there's not many of us, but again, I'm proud to do it.
On RFD, when you said she would listen for the voice of the pilot, what do you mean?
Yes, radio direction finder. They would tune in and turn the antenna until they actually heard the voice on that frequency that they were tuned into. They would actually hear the voices of the pilots and try to garner as much information from what the pilot was saying. They couldn't talk to the pilot, but they could hear what the pilot was saying and therefore be able to get his coordinate and send rescue.
Mary, on that line, were any of those recorded? Are any of those distress calls recorded?
Not that I know of, but they
historical
took notes. They frantically took notes and they were reviewed. So they would write as fast as they could, but I don't think that they were recorded.
Question here.
My question is for you, Doc. On your presentation, in your beginning, you're identifying what current problems are that are taking place. And I know there's a lot involved in that, but what can be done from the standpoint of your audience to take and help on those important issues?
Again, politics. I mean, you know, write your congressman, write your senator, get involved, get active. I love this country with all my heart, and when I see what's happening with our men and women in uniform, it breaks my heart. So whatever you can do to encourage our country to utilize its resources wisely. You know, I got furloughed, no problem. I'm ready, willing, and able to do whatever it takes to, you know, spend our money wisely and to balance our budgets. But when you see so much money being continually wasted in some areas, and then when they try to balance the budget, they do it on the back of our men and women in uniform, I just think that's upside down and backwards. So speak out. Again, start with your congressmen and your senators. But I think this is an important issue that a lot of Americans are not aware of.
As a historian, I'd like a background on your family. Your father is a World War I vet, your brother is a World War II vet, and you're obviously a lot younger than that.
That was the other gentleman. That was the gentleman who spoke.
Oh, I thought that was you.
No, that was the gentleman who spoke about the $5,000.
Excuse me.
Yeah. I'm actually first-generation American. My dad was German. And when I went to the 4th Fighter Group reunions, the guys would say, hey, you know, was your family in World War II? I was like, yeah, all over the world, both sides. Would we have met any of them? You might have shot them down. So.
This is a question to Dr. Higham. Well, I have a couple of questions. First of all, how important was it that the Royal Air Force was an independent force? I'm assuming independent of the rest of the military organizations in Britain. And the second question is, do you think Churchill would have squandered a fair number of squadrons in a futile defense of France in the last few days of their struggle against Nazi Germany had he not listened to his Air Force, Royal Air Force advisors?
I'll answer the second question first because the answer is yes. Churchill was very impetuous. He liked the French, and he would have gone on sending squadrons just in bits and pieces to support the French. And the Dowding's operational research people were very much more realistic, and they showed him how quickly he would destroy fighter command. The second question, which is really the first, the independence of the Royal Air Force, I think, was politically very important and opportune. They were assigned essentially the defense of England, which neither the Army nor the Navy had been able to accomplish against an air menace. And at that time, there was a lot of talk about the air menace and Douai and bombing cities into rubble. So that was important. It's also important that they had the leadership they had. Trenchard was in for 10 years after World War I, and he really was the father of the Royal Air Force. Not all his ideas were right, but he provided that basic impetus, and he got off to a quick start with Command 467, the structure of the Air Force.
Okay, another question?
This is for Robin. Robin, in your presentation, I heard you mention Douglas Bader on at least 3 separate occasions. Can you tell us some of his personal exploits during the war?
Well, he didn't last very long during the war. He got his fame from the fact that he lost his legs in an aerobatic accident about 1930. And he was a civilian up until war began. He talked himself back into the Air Force. He was a dynamic leader, but and then he did fly in the rhubarbs over France and got shot down. And they parachuted his spare legs to him, and he remained as a prisoner of war. The Bader story is still pretty controversial, I think, in the Royal Air Force, because it involves the politics of the Air Force. I mean, Bader was taken to a meeting at the Air Ministry to which Dowding was not alerted that it was going to take place until he actually walked into the room. So he hadn't brought his deputies with him. And Lee Mallory, when he went to number 12 group, told someone that he was going to get rid of Dowding. So there's a lot of politics there, and I don't know yet all of the inside.
If I could add one thing, if any of you have the military channel on your cable set, they've been doing a series called Air Aces on Sunday night, and they did a full hour on Bader, and it's a great story. So they did Robin Olds one night, but it's predominantly been a British broadcast. Question here.
Can you talk about the contributions of the Polish pilots during the Battle of Britain?
The Polish pilots were put into number 303 Squadron because they didn't speak English. They got a commanding officer who did happen to speak Polish, and so they acquitted themselves very well. They were very reckless and both very disciplined. Also, were experienced. And that's one of the stories that's not much told about the Battle of Britain, is that the shabby way in which the RAF treated foreigners who had gotten out of Europe and came to England. And the French had been no better. I mean, they made them mechanics or air gunners or something and did not recognize their skills. Language was a problem at first. And then, of course, you have the personalities of the people who came. I mean, I was stationed for a short while with the French, and the RAF moved the French out of Harrogate, which was the holding station, as quickly as they could to some French airfield. Because the French, it was snowing. The French would show up a half an hour after the parade was supposed to go, and their view was, well, it took the English half an hour to get organized. While I have the mic for a minute, I'd like to just add something about this air sea rescue business. The RAF set up sometime about 1942 the so-called Darky network, which was on 1,650, I think, kilocycles. And if you had an emergency, you switched to the Darky channel, and all you had to do was just say Darky, Darky. And someone would answer you, and they would triangulate you. And they recognized that, you know, bomber crews particularly were expensive and necessary. So if you were lost, they would put up 3 searchlights in a cone. There was an airfield you could go to. And they would handle the air sea rescue, triangulations and everything. Yeah.
Oh, we got some more.
What is the location of the base that Doc talked about? What is the location of the Eagle Squadron?
It's Seymour Johnson Air Force Base, which is in Goldsboro, North Carolina.
North Carolina.
It's between Raleigh and the sea, and it's about halfway between Virginia and South Carolina. So it's in the eastern part of the state.
What did Dowding do in the United States? And did he stay in the United States, or did he go back to England? What happened to him?
He didn't stay very long. He was not a good public relations person. And so he only stayed a short time, and then he went back and he retired. And he has another reputation as rather a religious mystic in his post-RAF years. But I've read some of that stuff that he wrote, and I don't think it's really very strange. It is to people who don't go to church.
One last question.
This is kind of a counterfactual question for Dr. Higham, but had Goering not switched his strategic approach and continued bombing airfields and other air support facilities, can you see a different result from the Battle of Britain?
Yeah, it might have been an even closer run thing. It really was not a great victory. It was more like Wellington said, a very near run thing. And it's difficult to guess, of course, the future in history, but you could do a game on it and see how that comes out.
Video game.
Yeah.
Well, listen, we're going to stop right now. There's books in the back. There's prints in the back. These guys are down here to talk to individually. So thank you for coming. Next month we're doing the bombing in the Pacific with Barrett Tillman, who many of you know as one of the great aviation historians. See you next month.
Underwriting for this program provided by 8th Air Force Historical Society of Minnesota. Additional support provided through the Catherine B. Anderson Fund of the St. Paul Foundation. Upcoming roundtable topics can be found at www.mn-ww2roundtable.org. Production services provided by Barrows Productions.